signal is the absence of a unified, consistent, and universally applicable response to the crisis. The responses that are emerging to the crisis around the globe span from those that reflect substantial continuity with neoliberalism to those that reveal much greater degree of discontinuity with neoliberalism. And so for those like me and for so many people here at this conference who have worried about neoliberalism as a kind of straitjacket over policy space in developing countries, I think this new incoherence that's emerging may signal the tentative beginning of the end of neoliberalism, at least of the ends of some of the most important aspects of neoliberalism. I think it's very important that we don't prejudge the historical moment as one of continuity, but rather that we see it as one of aperture and of rupture. And I think there are lots of different ways of thinking about how this incoherence is starting to manifest itself. And I want to mention some of these ways. Last week, for instance, the IMF released 2 studies that I think provide an important window into the ways that the crisis is causing mainstream economists to begin to question some of their widely held beliefs. In one paper, a group of fund economists argued that central banks should adjust upwards the acceptable target of inflation from the 2% that's long been in vogue during much of the neoliberal era to 4%. Now, I'd certainly like to see the fund's economists go much, much further and renounce inflation targeting altogether, and at the very least recognize that even a 4% targeted rate of inflation is much too low in many developing countries because of its effects on economic growth. I think we can't, nevertheless, overlook the significance of this particular finding. I think by doubting, that is to say, by doubling the acceptable rate of inflation based on current experiences, the fund's economists have begun to, I think, create space that validates earlier work by progressive academic economists. Here I'm thinking, for example, of Jerry Epstein, who was here this morning, and Aaron Gialdane, and a variety of civil society organizations that have been battling the fund for a long time over its strident and damaging inflation targets. The other IMF study that I want to mention is their study of controls over capital inflows, also released over the last 8 or so days. I think this study is also notable to progressives. It demonstrates that the fund is continuing the admittedly slow and uneven process, which they began after the Asian financial crisis, of wrestling with the issue of capital controls. Up until the Asian crisis, as you know, the fund was poised to modify its articles of agreement to make the liberalization of international capital flows among the central purposes of the fund and to extend the fund's jurisdiction to international capital movements. But in the wake of that crisis, the IMF started to change its views of capital controls modestly and cautiously, to be sure. But nevertheless, in the context of the post-Asian crisis environment, the center of gravity at the fund moved away from an unequivocal fundamentalist opposition to all capital controls to a kind of tentative, tepid, conditional support for some types of capital controls under some circumstances. And I think given the inertia at the fund, the actions during the current crisis represent, by the standards of the fund, a minor revolution. Iceland, one of the first economies to implode in the early stages of the current crisis, has a standby arrangement with the fund that includes provisions regarding the need for stringent capital controls. Of course, those capital controls were implemented by the Icelandic Central Bank prior to signing an agreement with the fund, but the fund's agreement with Iceland made a very strong case for the necessity of the maintenance of those capital controls in order to restore financial stability. It's of course worth mentioning that change in terms of thinking about capital controls has been very uneven. At the fund, you've had 1 step back and 2 steps forward and a kind of dance around this issue going on since the Asian crisis. There's been a raft of reports issued in the context of the current crisis that mention the issue of capital controls on many occasions, and most of those reports have contained rather tepid statements about the protective role of capital controls in some countries, about how they should be used temporarily as a last resort, and the fund has also taken great care to enumerate the costs of imposing capital controls. But what we saw in the fall of 2009, this past fall, were I think continued signs that the IMF was still wrestling with the issue of capital controls. When Brazil implemented capital controls this past October, I think we saw new signs that the fund was still wrestling with this issue of capital controls. The fund issued a kind of mild rebuke of Brazil in the context of its capital controls. It was really a kind of mild disapproval that noted that these kinds of controls have proven porous over time in a number of countries. But in contrast with the fund's past behavior, say when Malaysia put in place its capital controls, the IMF's response was rather muted and seemed more about trying to deter other countries from pursuing capital controls without the fund's blessing, so to speak. This new IMF paper that was just released in the last week, I think, reaches far beyond the IMF's public statements and practices on capital controls to this point. The authors of this study commend capital controls for having prevented economic contraction in a number of countries during the current crisis, for having reduced levels of financial fragility, for having lengthened the maturity structure of countries' external liabilities, and improving the composition of capital inflows. The report also notes that capital controls can retain their potency even if investors devise strategies to evade these controls. And that unrestrained capital flows can contribute to collateral damage in developing countries. I think this suggests that we're not talking about your grandfather's IMF. There are other parts of the report that have some of the typical and expected qualifications, to be sure, but none of these qualifications are offered as inseparable obstacles to the use of controls, and I think that in and of itself represents a kind of minor advance on the part of the fund that we would do very well as progressives to try to exploit. Very quickly, I just want to mention a couple of other ways in which we could see how the crisis is contributing to the incoherence that may ultimately prove productive of policy space for development. And I'll mention just three other facets of incoherence here very quickly. First, the IMF stands on fiscal policy in the numerous standby arrangements it signed during the current financial crisis. In the context of these numerous standby agreements that the IMF has signed, the IMF has taken a somewhat different and far less coherent response to the crisis than it did, let's say, in the context of the East Asian crisis. Certainly, the IMF continues to apply pressure to developing countries to secure compliance with stringent fiscal and monetary policy targets, but it's demonstrated a much greater degree of flexibility when some countries have been unable to meet their fiscal targets. This fiscal policy flexibility has been offset, as I must acknowledge before someone else does, by the IMF's continued insistence on stringent monetary policy, notwithstanding the very recent report on inflation targeting by the fund. And I think what this is suggestive of, again, is this incoherence, that the IMF has an apparent lack of certainty about how exactly to respond to the current crisis, and in that context is sending very mixed signals even about the kinds of fiscal and monetary policy responses that are appropriate. A second dimension of this incoherence that I want to mention relates to changes in the global economy. Time will have to tell, of course, how the expansion of the G7 to the G20 is ultimately going to influence the balance of global economic power and the salience of neoliberal ideology. At this point, we simply don't know. I think it's notable that the developing countries that are now lending to the IMF and those that are now sitting at the G20 table are countries where their development strategies have run distinctly counter to neoliberalism. And more importantly, the countries that appear to be coming out of the crisis most successfully are countries where neoliberalism also has a very limited import. China, I would also mention, has a new position at the fund. This is also a very recent development. I think collectively it's hard to imagine that these kinds of changes in participation in the global economy, power in the global economy, aren't going to have some practical effects on policy space in the future. The last dimension of this policy incoherence that I just want to highlight relates to something we talked about in the context of the first session this morning, and that is the way that problems in the European periphery may be helping to discredit the